Welcome to History 111, Lecture 41, Military Considerations. So entering into the war, the North had certain advantages with regards to the railway network, the population base, and also the manufacturing, whereas the South had advantages such as they were fighting a defensive war, and they tend to have a higher level of support among their population. But most importantly, they had most of the better military leaders on their side. Now, Abraham Lincoln himself had a better grasp of strategy than many of his generals, although he had little military experience, and that tended to be oddly advantageous, because he realized it was not about occupying territory, which was kind of a traditional and orthodox view. He realized it was about eliminating the South's ability to continue the war. So Lincoln is not really constrained by traditional military thinking. And that's going to ultimately help the North throughout the course of this conflict. Now, in the beginning, Winfield Scott is going to become the commander of the Union Army at the beginning of the war, but he's elderly, he's a hero of the Mexican War, and he's going to retire from military service at the end of 1861 at age 75, and he really is lacking the energy to maintain a conflict of this scale, so Lincoln's going to have to start looking for replacements right away. Now, McClellan is going to go ahead and be appointed as the Chief of Staff, and the Chief of Staff's job is basically to be the principal military advisor to the President, and also basically run the Army. The problem is McClellan has an inadequate grasp of strategy, he's very arrogant, and Lincoln returns to the field within months. So for about a year, Lincoln has no Chief of Staff and runs the war himself. Ultimately, he appoints a man named Halleck, but Halleck's ineffectual. He really can't get the job done, and ultimately ends up leaving the major decisions to Lincoln, which really, when you're the Chief of Staff, your job is to advise the President and not force the President to make all the big decisions, but rather give the President the ability to paint the big picture. So Lincoln has to basically run a lot of things himself anyway, even once he appoints this person, and that's not really functional. Now, Grant is finally appointed as the Chief of Staff in March of 1864, and here we have a Chief of Staff that Lincoln can finally hand the war over to. Now, Grant is going to share Lincoln's view that the key to breaking the Confederate Army was eliminating the resources necessary to wage war, and he believed that territorial gains were irrelevant except when it served the goal of depriving the enemy of vital resources. So that meant that when those two came together and agreed, Lincoln gave Grant basically a free hand to wage the war as he saw fit. Lincoln insisted on being given a broad outline for approval, but left all the details for Grant, so we're really finally operating as a Chief of Staff and President should, with the Chief of Staff planning everything and getting the President to sign off on the big picture. Now, while Grant had Lincoln's trust, Grant's handling of the war underwent constant scrutiny from Congress, and there was a Committee on the Conduct of the War that tended to be really full of hot air and claimed the Army was insufficiently ruthless due to some secret Southern sympathy, and really all Congress was doing was getting in the way of actually winning the war, and Grant had to fight against that, and that had been something that kind of plagued a lot of Union generals throughout this conflict. Now, unlike Lincoln, Jefferson Davis had been a professional soldier, and that means that he believes that he knows how to wage this war and that he's the right man to lead the Army. And that's going to ultimately be problematic because he's never going to create an effective command system. Early on, Robert E. Lee is going to be named as Davis's principal military advisor, but Lee was a field commander and left Richmond after only a few months and was rarely in regular contact with Davis. And it's not until February of 1864 that Bragg is named to replace him as advisor, but he's only giving technical advice on certain aspects, and that is because Davis won't share control of strategy with anyone. Now, eventually Lee is put in overall command, but that's February of 1865. But even then, Davis is reluctant to give up any control, and the war ends before Lee can make any changes to the command structure. One thing we should realize that for the professional military officers that had been regular Army officers before the war, a lot of them had been trained at the same military academies, were often personal friends. So these Union Confederate soldiers knew each other and were really thinking about war in the very same way, and they tended to be thinking about it based on capturing territory. Now, when it came to these militia volunteer units that were all raised during the war, a lot of local leaders raised regiments and named themselves as officers, and most of these people were unreliable at best and had limited, if any, prior military experience, and so they really weren't necessarily the best person for those jobs. Now, as this war is developing, one of the significant factors is a Union blockade, and the idea there was to attempt to prevent any ships from entering Confederate ports, but that's never fully effective. But during the war, the Union is going to begin seizing ports one at a time to deny their use, and the idea is to cut off the ability to import war materials. Now, the last key port doesn't fall until 1865, but every time they take a port, it further restricts the South's ability to wage war. And every ship they intercept is one that cannot carry them, cargo, and so on. So it's going to be a stranglehold. It's not fully effective, but it is something that is contributing as a factor. Now, the Confederates are going to have to turn to military innovation to try to break the blockade. Now, ironclads were one particular area. Now, Europeans had really come up with this idea of using iron warships as a result of various new technologies developed and implemented during the Crimean War. And there was something of an arms race happening between the French and the British as they were both starting to launch iron warships in 1859-1860. Now, the South took inspiration from this and decided to refit a scuttled Union frigate in 1862. Now, the Union also learned of this plan and designs and launches their own all-iron warship within 118 days. Now, when the Confederate ironclad first put to sea, it was really able to devastate the Union ships blockading that area. But on that same day during that battle, the Union ironclad arrived and engaged it, and once the two sides engaged each other in this stalemate, neither ship was able to really successfully damage the other. And what that meant was that this is going to change the nature of the blockade, but the South's real attempt at having an advantage was unfortunately taken right out from under them, with the Union doing the same thing. They also began to experiment with things like submarines that could pull right up to a ship and plant explosive charges and so on, but really what happens over time is the Confederates are ultimately unable to challenge the Union Navy effectively, and the Union not only is going to control the seas, but also over time control all the river traffic and control vital transport arteries using their navy. Now, one of the really important things about that blockade is that it cut the Confederates off from Britain and France. Now, both of these were sympathetic to the South, and both depend on cotton imports, and they saw the war as the way to weaken the United States as a commercial rival. Now, France was unwilling to support the Confederate States officially unless Britain did so first. But Britain's public support tended to favor the North, and with the Emancipation Proclamation, this led to mass anti-Confederate meetings in Britain and really ends British support for the Confederate States altogether. Now, the British public really supported the anti-slavery platform, even with the economic problems and unemployment that were being brought on by a lack of Southern cotton. So that lack of Southern cotton was deeply impacting their own industries, but at the same time, the public believed the slavery issue was far more important and outweighed any short-term economic hardships. Let's take a second to consider the West. Except for Texas, all of the West officially remained within the Union. However, not everyone in the West supported the Union. There was widespread low-intensity conflict in Confederate Arizona, within the Indian Territory, Missouri, and Kansas, and so on. There were a lot of skirmishes between pro- and anti-Union forces, which tended to be local factions fighting against each other. Now, there were some notable atrocities where small bands of Confederate supporters would enter small pro-Union settlements and kill everyone they could find, and there were reprisals launched by others. For example, John Brown's son did the same thing and went ahead and slaughtered Confederate supporters and so on. And within the Indian Territory, people are going to end up fighting for both sides, and that's going to sometimes cause conflict between the factions. And one of the significant reasons why the Indian Territory is going to try to side with the Confederates, although not universally, was that the Confederates had promised them their own state within the Confederacy. It is worth noting that the last Confederate general to surrender was a Cherokee, and was one of only two Native American generals in the war. The other one was a man named Eli Parker, who was from the Seneca tribe. We should take a second to consider the scale of the war. When it comes to American deaths, in the Civil War, there were 618,000, and that's more than World War I and World War II combined. And when we look at that as deaths per 100,000 of population, in the Civil War it was 2,000 deaths per 100,000. In other words, 2% of the population. Whereas in World War I, it was 0.1%. World War II, 0.2% of a percent. This is a very small fraction of World War I and World War II compared to the Civil War. So this, in a lot of ways, is going to be America's bloodiest war. Now, there are going to be some big changes in warfare at this point. First and foremost is repeating weapons that are going to speed reloading. And people at this point are going to be really thinking about line infantry and formation still. And those are things that made a lot of sense 100 years earlier when people were relying on muskets. And with muskets, they're not very accurate. So you have to put a lot of lead downrange in the hopes of hitting anything. So standing there and using volley fire makes a lot of sense with those weapons. But these new weapons are going to mean these lines are going to break very quickly and lead to complete chaos on the battlefield and higher casualty rates. In addition, there's better ammo, it's more accurate and longer range. And they're also going to see similar improvements with artillery artillery, so that standing and fighting has become a really bad idea, because this new artillery has better range, more firepower. They're relying on canister shot that's basically going to make artillery into giant shotguns that can take out large sections of a line at a time. And as a result of all of these things, as the battles are evolving, this becomes the first American war in which widespread fortifications and entrenching is used on a regular basis. The typical field army could reach about 250,000 men, and transporting and sustaining an army of that size is going to rely very heavily on the railroads, and that's going to also tend to force commanders into large engagements rather than small ones, because they're reliant on where the railroads can go and where they can get supplies. So they really don't have the option of spreading their armies out. Now, the telegraph is also going to play a big role here. That's going to allow for speedy communication between commanders and political leadership, and Lincoln would spend all night listening to reports coming in, for example. So what's the big idea? Well, first and foremost, the Union eventually gets an effective command structure by 1864, although Congress is still an impediment. The South, on the other hand, never achieves that. There's also the blockade, which is going to strangle the South over time and is going to cut them off from potential allies. There's also new technology that's going to change the face of warfare, and ultimately we have to remember, in a lot of ways, the Civil War is America's bloodiest war. See you in the next lecture.